All right. Welcome back to another episode of the All Me podcast. I'm Brian Parker, Director of Education, and your host for today's episode. I'm excited for today's episode. In fact, if you are a regular listener to this podcast, you probably already recognize our guest, but we get to hang out with Ashley Anderson again, who we recently just talked about her career. She's a sports pharmacist, so she has knowledge in a lot of different areas, and we wanted to bring her back to tap into that knowledge a little bit and tackle the topic of nootropics. This is a topic we continue to get a lot of questions about during our presentations, and because of that, we try our best to tackle those issues here on the podcast as well and spread that education back to you. So today's podcast will be a little bit tricky because nootropics is a very broad category of things, but Ashley's an expert. We're going to try our best to narrow down on this and tackle some of the more popular categories within that umbrella of topics. So let's start this off. Ashley, welcome back to the show. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm great. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate this. This is a question that I get all the time as well. So I can see why the demand is there and people have been asking about it in your comments.
Yeah, it keeps popping up more and more. You know, we hand out our cell phone number basically at all of our presentations. That's how we get a lot of our questions. And as those come in, we kind of know what people are more and more curious about, and we use that as kind of a launching point for this podcast. All right, let's answer these questions. Let's find people that have more knowledge than us about it, and that happens to be you. So it's good to see your face again. And we'll spend most of our time talking about nootropics. I always start these podcasts off with a little bit of background on our guests, which I don't actually want to spend that much time doing with you because we just did a whole episode on that.
Yeah.
But just in case someone missed that, which I can't believe anybody would have, but just in case someone missed that episode, let's start with just a touch of background on you. My first question, I always say, is a bit of an unfair one because I ask people to sum up their life story in like one answer. Right. But let's try our best. So tell us a little bit of background on you. Basically, look, anything you want to share from your story, including perhaps education and career path that led you up to what you do now, because I know you worked with USADA for a little while as well. So any knowledge in that area would be a good place to start.
Sure. So I am a pharmacist by training. And I knew from the age of 12 that I wanted to be a pharmacist because I loved chemistry. I loved understanding how things worked in people's bodies. I was really interested in plants and nature. And so I went into pharmacy to study the pharmacognosy side, which is the study of plants and how they affect people's bodies. And when I got to college, they actually cut that course. Nice. So the trend was going away from natural products and moving very quickly towards biotech. And, I was in Indianapolis studying, and that's the home of Eli Lilly. And insulin is one of our first big biotech drugs that was naturally produced from a copy of what we make in our body. So, just that timing of it, moving the whole, career moving away from natural products, I decided to leave pharmacy school for a while and actually go study herbal medicine in China. And so I left pharmacy school after my second year. I spent 3 years actually in total in China studying Chinese medicine. And so that's where, I first gained some of the knowledge and what we'll be talking about today with some of these products. But then after I went back and I finished pharmacy school, and I ended up going into hospital pharmacy. So I worked generally in hospitals where I get to do a clinical role, which means I'm actually out on the floors talking to patients in their rooms while they're at the hospital. And so, I obviously still work in the whole allopathic side, Western medicine side, and kind of kept that Eastern medicine knowledge in the back of my brain. But once I started working for the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, which was actually in 2006, I have all these questions, start coming up again from a lot of the athletes and my friends who are athletes. And they were asking about just different ways they could use herbal medicines. Or, as you know, a lot of medicines are sold, or a lot of herbal medicines are sold as dietary supplements. And so those questions would just come up all the time. And so I worked for the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency for up until 2021, I think it was, that my contract ended. So, just over 15, 16 years. And so my expertise is in anti-doping and really being able to interpret the WADA prohibited list for athletes, kind of take that information and put it into lay terms that people can understand based on their specific situation. And I've never been a professional athlete myself. I'm a snowboarder. I love hiking. I've always been into adventure racing, things like that are recreational sports. And but yeah, I still work with athletes, and now I've turned my focus more to training more pharmacists to be able to answer athletes' questions. So yeah,
Yeah, that's a good job. You did it. That's like might be the toughest question I ask you all day to sum up your life in like
right.
2 minutes, but you did it. That's a couple unique things about your story. Number one, the fact that you kind of knew what you wanted to do early on, I think is actually fairly rare. But then you get into it and they pull your program away and you study over. That probably wasn't part of the initial plan, but it
No.
all guided you to what you're doing now. And what you're doing now is actually what we spent a whole conversation with you talking about, because a lot of people might not even know what a sports pharmacist is. So if you're wondering what that is, you should go back and listen to Ashley's previous podcast. But I guess I'll ask you that question as well, just because it'll help set the table a little bit more for this discussion. So without diving too deep on this, tell us a little bit what's involved with being a sports pharmacist, and maybe a good way to tackle that is, what does your day-to-day look like? I'm sure that differs a good bit, but
Yeah.
what's a typical day on the schedule?
So, believe it or not, pharmacists don't have training in anti-doping in pharmacy schools right now. It's not part of the core curriculum. So, a pharmacist who specializes in sports, they generally go on their own path, studying sports sciences and studying anti-doping and understanding what is prohibited in sport. And so, when we work with athletes, we're really focusing on what is appropriate for this athlete based on their sport and what kind of drugs do we need to avoid. Most of the time when I work with athletes, I'm talking about medication safety. So selecting the appropriate over-the-counter medication to treat pain, for instance, or what medications need to be avoided, not just for the status of drug in sport, whether or not it's banned or prohibited, but what could actually potentially affect their eyesight or their sleep patterns or things like that that will actually impact their performance indirectly. So that's kind of a summary of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's basically taking a field of knowledge and applying it to a certain field. I can relate that a little bit to myself when I was younger. When I went to school, I actually, different from you, had no idea what I wanted to do. So I went to a small school. I went to Elon University, but I studied sports management. And the reason why is because I was like, okay, I'll get a business degree because that's applicable in a lot of different places, right? But then I kind of saw sports management as an option. I was like, well, I kind of like this because it's a business degree applied to a certain field, and I could take this idea of theory and knowledge and put it into something that I had some interest in. So I think that's probably somewhat of an overlap, right? Like you had
Yes.
this overall knowledge and you were like, okay, let's apply it to this certain group of people, certain demographics, certain sports. And that's interesting. I definitely advise people to go back and listen to it, because it might be a field that's, I would imagine, a field that's growing.
Yeah,
So if you
absolutely.
want to learn more about it, you should tune into that. And that obviously does a really good job setting the table for a discussion, because I can imagine you do have a ton of knowledge on what we're about to talk about, which is nootropics. And I guess a good place for us to kick off that conversation is attempting our best to summarize what nootropics is. Now, as I said at the beginning, that's tricky because this is going to mean a lot of different stuff. So let's try our best to narrow that down. So how do you define nootropics? Because maybe a lot of our listeners have heard of them as smart drugs. I don't know if that's a fair description. You tell me how you sum it up, and then maybe in general, how do they work? Although that's going to differ probably product to product as well. But one more tough summary question for you.
Right. Yeah. So this one is really tough because it does encompass a whole different, many, many different classes of medications. And so, just to summarize it, I think that smart drugs are misleading because they don't necessarily make a person more wise in
Fair,
any sense of
yes,
the word.
fair.
But so they're meant to be cognitive enhancers or sometimes intended for brain health. When it comes to prescription nootropics, we typically are looking at things that are used to treat patients who have actual mild cognitive deficiencies or actual organic brain disorders that we're trying to treat. So as you mentioned, there are many, many different classes of drugs, herbs, and supplements that fall into what we would call these cognitive enhancers, but they're intended to help with clarity of focus, memory, behavior, and sometimes emotional control.
Okay.
So yeah, it's really wide ranging.
I assumed you had a better description than smart drugs, because you're right. That seems like a bit of a misnomer that I can just take this and bump my IQ score. So
Right.
that's
Yeah.
fair. I guess I'm curious because you probably have knowledge on this based on your background looking at Eastern and Western medicine. So what percentage of this would you say that fall within this category are derived naturally? How often are they synthetically produced? How often are they prescription drugs? Can you apply numbers to that? I feel like
Oh gosh.
a lot of what we're talking about is derived naturally, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that a lot of these were originally derived from natural products.
Okay.
So a lot of the chemicals do come from plant sources, herb sources originally, and they have been since made into either semi-synthetic, meaning somewhat modified in the lab, or our pharmaceutical companies have taken just one chemical out of that herb and then modify that to be a synthetic drug that's just reproduced in a lab.
Okay.
So maybe, I mean, just as a really rough estimate, it could almost be like a third, a third, a third, if
Okay.
you were to break it up in that way. Even some foods that are medicinal foods could be considered cognitive enhancers. So it is really wide ranging,
Makes
and
sense.
yeah, and maybe the difference would come down to the dose, the strength and the dose, and how specific the chemical is.
All right. That makes sense. And I would imagine as modern medicine continues to evolve, there might be more synthetically products that just
Yes.
keep popping up along the way, just as we
Yeah.
can. And as this gains more and more popularity, we'll probably see more and more things pop up. So the future remains unseen on this. But
Uh-huh.
in the current state of things, I want to take the overall category and probably evolve this conversation and start discussing specific products within that. Because
Yeah.
as you stated from the very beginning, a lot of these are sold as dietary supplements at this point, right? So I want to talk about which of them have some good research behind them, which of them don't. So let's start with a couple really well-researched ones that actually people may not understand fall into the nootropics category, and that's caffeine and creatine. So
Yeah.
we've done podcasts on both of those topics already. So if you have more interest in those, you should go back and listen to that. I don't want to ask you too much about them. I want to focus on those two in relation to cognitive function. Do you have any thoughts relating to those two categories? They're completely different things, obviously, but there's a ton of research behind both of them. Are you seeing a lot of it come out in the cognitive side of things?
Yeah. So, a lot of the research that is related to caffeine is obviously in adults. And that is because caffeine reacts differently in pediatrics or children. And so, in children, you might see more of like a respiratory response, which is not necessarily something that we want to use caffeine for, something
Sure.
that we want to avoid in younger aged people. But for adults, we do see that it does help with wakefulness. And so maybe that does help with some people's attention. It doesn't replace what you can get from natural sleep and having, good sleep hygiene, obviously, but it does actually promote wakefulness in the brain. And with caffeine, it does also depend on the timing of when the person decides to, take their caffeinated beverage. And then dose is also very important as well. So, if you look at something that is just like a regular 12-ounce cup of coffee, it's less than 100 milligrams of caffeine typically. If you look at a no-dose over-the-counter caffeine tablet, that might have 100 milligrams of caffeine in that one tablet. And so the dose does matter, and the timing of when a person takes that dose obviously matters. And, typically a lot of people drink caffeine right away in the morning when they wake up, but it is actually would be more of a benefit to the person if they could wait an hour and, drink water and do a different morning routine before they actually drink caffeine to allow the body's own adenosine response to wake up first and become active before they drink caffeine in order for that, the caffeine itself to be more effective and not try to, overcome what our body could do naturally. So obviously there is good evidence. There's even evidence that it does enhance performance. We know that, but because caffeine is in so many sources, obviously coffee and tea, but other food sources, and it is so widely used throughout the world, it's not prohibited in sport. It is limited. There is a threshold, especially for student athletes who are tested with NCAA. They have a threshold that they have to be mindful of, but we do know that it works, and that's probably why it's so popular.
Yeah.
And then
I'm
when
gonna tell.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm gonna tell my. I'm gonna tell my other half that you said this because she drinks coffee when she immediately wakes up, and I'm gonna say no. I'm gonna make her wait an hour now that I've learned this from you, and I can't. I'm gonna blame it on you if she gets upset with me. All
right,
right.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's more evidence coming out as we can understand more specifically, with newer testing strategies that we have and newer ways that we can actually look and see how the brain responds to drugs. Now that we have more specific ways that we can look at what's happening with drugs in the brain, we can see now better ways to actually use medication sometimes. And caffeine is one of those that, even though it's something that's been used for centuries, we're having new evidence come out on how we might be able to use it more effectively. So yeah, even just a glass of water, an apple, or even hot water. Sometimes just having hot water to sip on in the morning will meet that urge.
I like it. Yep, I'm gonna let her know. And then on the creatine side of things, because I get a ton of questions about that.
Yeah.
And I know, again, we could go into so many angles on that. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's creatine is an energy source. It's naturally, produced. You can get in your diet, but there seem to be a lot of research coming out about the cognitive side of things, brain health. They're looking at it for concussions. What's the research you're seeing on the cognitive side of creatine? I'm sure there's a lot we still got to learn there.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I haven't updated myself on this in about 2 years, so I think I'm really out of date.
That's fair.
Because it's advanced so quickly, like you're saying, we're finding that the last I was reading was just increasing evidence with actually really high quality studies of using creatine in elderly patients to improve their cognitive function. And, so having that extra source of nutrients for the body does seem to impact cognitive function. So I don't think I'm the most up to date when it comes to creatine, but as with any dietary supplement, I'm just really specific about what product I talk to the athletes about using, or even my general patients, making sure that it's not potentially contaminated with anything else.
Sure.
And but the creatine does have good evidence for using it for cognitive function in at least what I read most recently in patient populations who have mild cognitive decline.
Yeah.
And we know it works in healthy patients as well. So
Yeah, it's been so well researched at this point, and there's still a lot of research to come. The podcast we did with Dr. Richard Kreider, you should go back and tune in. We dive into a lot of this stuff, but yeah, I know that there's a lot of benefits coming out, even beyond the whole energy source performance side of things. So that's something that we will both continue to keep an eye on. I want to take those two categories or those two substances and go a little bit deeper, because a lot of people may not have known that those two fall within the nootropics category, but there's a few that are out there that, from what I've seen, have a little bit of good research behind them. So I'm going to go to my notes here because I don't want to mess these names up. All right. But you tell me. I'm going to put three. They're probably completely different in what exactly they do, but they seem to be the most widespread research backing products that fall under this umbrella. So the ones that I'm looking at, L-theanine, CDP choline, and Bacopa Monnieri. How did I do?
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yep.
Is the research that I'm reading valid? I mean, it's so hard. You can dig through studies and how
Yeah.
much was peer reviewed and who funded
Yes.
them and all that kind of good stuff. So can they play a role here? Do they have any benefit, or what are you seeing?
So with a Bacopa Monnieri, sorry, I can't even get it up myself.
That's a tricky
But
one.
with that, for instance, so the most recently a meta-analysis that I had looked at didn't show any benefit.
Okay,
When it was tested against placebo, the placebo effect was equivalent, and so that was, I like any good pharmacist, when I'm answering this as a true supplement information or drug information for an athlete, I always go back and consult, my resources, my peripheral brain, as I call it. So there's good sources online like PubMed, or sources that put this information together, like examine.com actually does some nice write-ups and tries to pull evidence from pretty good sources. As you mentioned, when I look at how effective is a medication and is it going to be appropriate for this individual, has it been tested in otherwise healthy people, I'm really trying to break down that study to determine whether or not it's a biased outcome, or did they
sure,
actually look at the right outcome. So what you've said is so important when I'm looking at the actual data related to the information or to that substance. So on that one, the last I had read that it just didn't offer much of a benefit. It's not necessarily harmful, but I think that most of the information, one of the things that I also consider in studies is that, did they use a product that was really a high quality product, standardized to the right percentage of the chemical constituent in that plant? So some of these things, it's hard to actually interpret the data that came out of that study with not knowing if the what we're working with on the front end is really the most effective product. So as of right now, that one is just kind of a wash, probably not worth a person's money. Remind me of the other two you asked.
L-theanine. So
Oh,
L-theanine and CDP
gosh.
choline.
L-theanine, so it's from tea sources, and so again, just if you're a tea drinker, then you're getting some in that way.
Okay,
With that actual chemical, they're taking one chemical out of a tea compound, and then we're isolating that chemical and putting it in a higher concentration into a tablet form or capsule form, and so the person's taking a more concentrated form of that chemical, so a higher dose. For some people, um, I have seen it that they report that it is effective for anxiety, for managing anxiety, for helping with their sleep schedule. And I don't think that it can be used alone. I think so when it comes to medications or drugs or any kind of dietary supplement that's used for anxiety, I don't think that it should be used to try to eliminate anxiety, right? Anxiety is one of those beneficial responses that we have in our flight or fight or flight response that is telling us that we need to cope with some event that's happening, and we don't want to take something that's going to try to manage that anxiety level down to zero.
yeah,
So when it comes to L-theanine, I look at that as something as maybe a person who has like an anxiety level of a 8 or 9 on a scale of 10, and trying to manage it down to something that's a more manageable level where that they can then use their coping skills. So with that said, I do think that the L-theanine is potentially effective for quite a few people, and I've also seen people say that it does make them really drowsy, and kind of clouds their thinking as well. So the side effects are something that people really need to consider. But when it's used as caffeine instead of when it's used as tea instead of the single ingredient product, it actually may give more of a balanced effect, because
right.
tea has that caffeine to balance the potentially sedating effects of the L-theanine. And the one other thing I just want to mention here as well is that there are some other chemicals that are being used as dietary supplement, for brain health, that have very similar names to L-theanine, which I've seen people mix up or buy on accident online, like L-threonate, for instance, which is another cognitive enhancer, but it has a different effect and it's meant for a different purpose.
Yeah,
So,
that's
just one of those
confusing.
things of,
That's confusing as a consumer. That's even
yeah,
just if you read the first three letters are the same, you're probably not thinking
yeah,
much about it. CDP choline was the last one. Any thoughts there?
yeah.
Similar effects?
Yeah. So again, so sorry, I didn't do much research on this one as well, but I think that this is effective. Again, it's something that I would tell people to try to get from food sources
Yeah.
as well. I from the last that I read on it, it is again a mild effect, and I think it's dose related, and the timing of using the substance as well is really important. But with that, it really depends on what the person is trying to accomplish with what's their intention in using that. And with it, I also don't necessarily think that it should be used as a single drug. It needs to be used in combination with other medications, other supplements in order to
Yeah.
really
I feel
effective.
like you have a similar hesitation as I do, even just using the word effective, because people hear that and they think, oh, great, here's my answer. Here's a magic powder, or here's going to reduce all my stress or whatever.
Yeah,
I always say like supplements can play a role. Even like, I mean, if we went back to creatine, I tell students all the time, like, look, creatine is great. Like it's been proven to be safe. Like here's the role that it plays, but you can't just take it and not do anything else. It's not. There are no magic powders. There's
yeah,
no shortcuts and all this. Like
yeah,
things can play a role. So I can sense the same feeling from you that I have as well with a lot of this stuff. I'm on your side with it, right? Like we're
right.
not saying effective equals your answer. It just
Yes.
means here's a role that it could play.
Yeah. So along that same lines, these are popular because they have been shown in some studies. Maybe they're not human studies, maybe they're just in rats, but these ingredients are included in dietary supplements because there is some evidence that they work. And, that piece of some evidence tends to be enough for some people to think, oh, it's going
Yeah.
to work for me. But it is, especially with these substances, people respond very differently based on the environment that they're currently in and their current life situation. We all have different ways that we cope and manage our anxiety. We all have different behavioral responses. And so I find that people do respond quite differently to these cognitive enhancers.
Yeah, nothing's universal in life, I don't think, right? I mean, like if we just took caffeine, I'm not responsive really at all to it. I could go drink a 40-ounce cold brew and probably go to sleep right after that. Like I don't get too much of a sleep,
Right.
and other people would bounce off the walls with it. So it's nothing's universal, nothing's universally effective, but it is. You're right. It needs to be weaved into this conversation so people don't think, oh, this is this one study did this. Like here's what it'll do for me, and it'll cure this issue that I've got. Right? It's all part of the conversation as well. Which I think that also takes me to my next question, which is a couple products that I think are on the other end. If we're using the word effective or research, I think there's other products that fall under this umbrella that, from what I'm seeing, actually don't have a ton of research behind them. And you correct me if I'm wrong. A couple of ones that I bet people have heard about before are ginseng and ginkgo biloba. So I can remember even when I first started doing this, those two were super popular. People were thinking ginseng is like the memory cure-all type of deal, and then the more I look into it, the more I'm like, I don't know that this is really proven, and I don't get actually much questions about it anymore. I'm wondering if that's because the research really just isn't there to support it. Am I wrong in that, or are people still taking this for, what's the deal with those two things that have been around for a while now?
Yeah. So these both are very popular in Chinese medicine. I learned a lot about them while I was in China. And a piece of what I was studying about Chinese medicine was how to identify the quality of the herb
Hmm.
and, making sure it was collected at the right time of year in the appropriate environment, and, what was the soil quality like. So one of the issues that we have with those two is that neither of them are fast acting. They take years, they're typically preventative. They both fall in what we would consider an adaptogen category. And so within the herb itself, it has a balancing effect of things that are enhancing cognitive function and blood flow and things that are actually counterbalancing that. And so, so our, hold on a quick second, I got a little pop up. So, when we use those things in our bodies, they're having a positive effect and a negative effect, and it's trying to help our bodies balance over a very long period of time. And so I think they've dropped off in popularity because they don't have an immediate effect. A person
Yeah.
doesn't take a ginseng tea or a ginkgo biloba tea and feel like, wow, I have so much more of an attention span now, or look at my reaction
Yeah.
time. So with those two, they're when they're used in the traditional Chinese medicine setting, they're thinking about how am I going to prevent my cognitive decline 10 years from now? And, in the Western medicine setting, we're thinking like, am I going to feel an effect for tonight? Or am I
Right.
supposed to pass my exam right now? So it's a different expectation that we have. And so I think that that's why they've fallen out of popularity. I actually do think they have some pretty strong evidence from traditional Chinese medicine when prescribed by an herbalist.
That's good to know, actually, and that checks out because we are a shortcut society, for better or worse. We
Yeah,
we
instant
look for
gratification, right?
that is how we operate, right? So that would make sense why people, are like, well, I don't want to take this for 20 years. I'm trying to, resolve something right now. So
Right.
that's interesting knowledge and super good to keep in the back of our mind, because I know those have been around for a while, and again, no magic powders here, no magic pills, right? It can play a role, but it might take a while to play that role as well. So those are good to know. Those are popular. I get those questions, and then I've got two more products that I get a ton of questions about
Sure.
that fall under your umbrella as well. They're different, so you might have different answers for these two. But the two more that I get tons of questions about are ashwagandha. I'm getting tons of about it. We're actually about to release a podcast just about that, so you
Oh,
don't have to
great.
dive too deep on it. But that's one, and then magnesium as well, which is trickier because magnesium is like 7 different forms of it. I think L-theanine is the one that probably closely relates to what you and I are discussing. So we can focus on that form. So those two products, tell me your thoughts on those, what the research is showing, what potential benefits could be there.
Yeah. So with ashwagandha, it's another one of those herbs that's kind of an adaptogen, and so there is a long history of use in Ayurvedic medicine, and it is popular because it does have an effect. So the studies that I've read, it does have a benefit for using it for anxiety treatment. Again, just like I said before, I don't think it should be managed. I don't think it should be used to manage anxiety down to a goal of zero. We need to have coping skills in addition to using this, but the ashwagandha does seem to have an effect on cortisol levels. And with this, cortisol does help us manage our sleep wake cycle and the fight and flight response. And so when it's somehow affecting that cortisol, it does seem to help a person relax. And obviously, when a person has a better sleep quality, then they can potentially improve their performance and improve their ability to think clearly and have better focus. And so it's kind of an indirect impact that it has on a person's cognitive enhancement, if you want to call it
Got it.
that. So the studies are generally pretty small, but the historical use it does give pretty good evidence as to this being a potentially effective product. And when we're looking at things that are put into dietary supplements, a lot of times they're trying to isolate one chemical and standardize that to maximize that chemical in it. But again, it's an adaptogen, so you want to have a full herb that has the balance of both the positive and the negative effects, so it's not trying to overwhelm the system with any one chemical. And so magnesium is used throughout the body as a chemical that is needed for energy, powers our cells. And so with magnesium, that we have a blood-brain barrier that is very effective in preventing any kind of substances from crossing it. And so to get drugs to cross the brain, it typically doesn't happen unless it's a small chemical that is allowed to cross. The brain actually is like, okay, I can allow that chemical to cross. Or it needs a carrier molecule in order to help it be transported across the blood-brain barrier, or if the brain was inflamed for some reason, which we don't want the brain to be inflamed, so we don't want chemicals crossing for that reason. But when it comes to magnesium L-threonate that you mentioned, the L-threonate is actually a carrier molecule that is going to help transport the magnesium into the brain in a more effective way. So that portion of it, that carrier molecule, is actually a chemical that is derived from citrus fruits. I believe it comes from vitamin C. It's one of the metabolites of vitamin C. And we know that vitamin C, taken with other elements, other nutrients that we need in order for our body to absorb those, we know that vitamin C does enhance the absorption of other substances as well, like iron products. So when that vitamin C derivative is attached to the magnesium, it helps transport the magnesium into the brain a little bit easier. So I struggle with this one a little bit because to me, this is not a dietary supplement. It's actually a drug. It's modified. It's not an actual food source product. So I think that this one should be used, with the doctor's awareness, with some kind of oversight by a healthcare professional that knows the use of this as a medication before a person dives into trying it for themselves. That's my opinion. But I do find that the research does seem to support its use to enhance cognitive function. I just think that the studies are small and limited at this point.
Gotcha. I think there's tons of research still to be done in this whole area. I'm sure you agree with me as well. But those are probably the most popular products that I see getting thrown around online in regards to, hey, it could play a role here or there. But even those articles I read, most of them will admit, like, yeah, we're starting to see this or we're starting to see that, but we've still got a ways to go to see how all of this exactly plays out. And I guess I'll wrap up our conversation on products to give you an opportunity to tell us, is there anything else coming out in this space, this nootropic space, that really has no research behind it or potentially could
Oh,
even be risky that you're
yeah.
seeing people
Yes.
use?
Oh, yes. There are so many. I mean, let me try to just narrow it down to two. Um,
Okay.
so the and a lot of these are brought to my attention by young athletes. And so
Yeah.
thank you for asking these questions. Thank you for letting me know what you're finding online. I really appreciate it because they wouldn't be on my radar if people didn't ask. So don't be afraid to ask. And it's really helpful when they're brought to our attention. So one of them is a designer stimulant, basically, that that was found in I think it was a gamer athlete that actually brought it to my attention. And it's a modified version of a prescription substance called modafinil. So modafinil is used for patients who have narcolepsy, diagnosed narcolepsy, where a person falls asleep outside of their control. And so we treat them with modafinil to keep them awake. And so there was a modified version of this that came up in a dietary supplement that was flumodafinil. So not even something that we can pronounce in English. So right away it was a red flag. This is
Sure.
some chemical that someone put together. And I believe that it's a fluorinated version of this modafinil prescription drug, but it was appearing in a dietary supplement. So so that's just one example of a potentially very dangerous stimulant that was found in a dietary supplement. And there was no human research on it that I could find at all. And so potentially dangerous for anybody who might be taking it. And then another thing that comes to mind is products that have dopaminergic agents in it. So dopamine is a natural substance in our brain that is kind of one of the pleasure centers. It helps with mood. It's related to a lot of cognitive functions. And so one of the herbal products that's appearing in a lot of cognitive enhancers or brain health drugs is velvet bean, and velvet bean has L-dopa in it. And L-dopa is levodopa, which it transports into the brain quite easily. And once it crosses into the brain, then it's converted into dopamine and attaches to our dopamine receptors. But unfortunately, if we take too much dopamine, it actually can cause oxidative stress inside the brain and damage some of the serotonergic neurons that are, necessary for our mood stabilization. It's another really important chemical that we have, serotonin, in our brain. And so if a person is taking too much of a dopamine product, they can actually damage their brain more than they can actually help it. So that's a big risky one. But also, people might be familiar with the word levodopa because it is used for Parkinson's disease treatment. And we know that levodopa is very easily broken down in the other parts of the body before it even reaches the brain. And so a lot of these products that are on the market are probably not having much levodopa actually reach the brain, to cross that blood-brain barrier, the blood-brain barrier. So a lot of the products are probably not actually, worthwhile anyways. And another big risk with that is if a person's taking that for a while and does stop it abruptly, they can actually have some major withdrawal side effects, and that can really impact their neurological system. So yeah.
Yeah, that one, I would imagine the marketing on that one sounds good, right? Like, oh, I can take this. Let's just
Enhance your
bump up
dopamine.
dopamine.
Yeah.
Right. And your average consumer may not think too much about it. You're like me. It's like, okay, you learn about stuff when people ask you questions. That's how I am. I mean, there's what 40,000 supplements on the market now. I think at least. I mean, how is anyone supposed to keep up with all of that, right? So even being in this space, you learn about what people are making and selling and what's out there. And I'm just going to assume like you like I also believe, because we've done podcast episodes on this and kind of how the supplement industry is set up, that doesn't require a lot of approval, doesn't require much testing. There's regulation in play, but there's not a ton of enforcement behind that. So I'm just going to assume you're seeing the same kind of things that I am, where companies are taking advantage a little bit, right? Like, are you seeing stories of unapproved banned substances, nootropic substances popping up in supplement products? And if so, any advice that you have to help with the buying process, that people are looking for products in this space? Any red flags that you should tell people to be
Yeah.
aware of?
So when I was working with the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, they developed a really nice Supplement Connect reference site and a supplement guide and a high-risk list. And with that, we had put together steps for how to actually identify red flags and reduce the risk. A great resource out there is OPSS, the scorecard that they use
Yep.
to try to assess the red flags there. I use that all the time with athletes. And, just another thing, if, for any healthcare professionals that are listening to it, or people who might really dive a little bit deeper into the ingredients in the dietary supplement they're looking at, one thing that might be a red flag as well is just going back to the L-dopa for an example. So the L-dopa is from the velvet bean, and so it will list velvet bean as the ingredient, and then maybe in parentheses say 15% L-dopa. And so they're standardizing that chemical, that single chemical that's found in the herb, and they're trying to standardize that to maximize the amount of the that chemical that's in there. And so, for instance, I've seen products that list 15% L-dopa from the velvet bean, and that is kind of a red flag to me, because the natural product only typically has 5%. So if we were using the herbal medicine itself, we would hopefully have a 5% quantity of L-dopa in that herb. But then a high concentration product might be 7%. And so if the dietary supplement is claiming that they have 15% or 3 times what I would normally expect to see in that herb, it does raise some red flags as to whether or not it's modified in some way, or if something else is added to the product. So yeah, there are a lot of red flags when it comes to every dietary supplement.
Yeah. But again, your average consumer wouldn't know that
Oh,
5% fact or 15% or what the difference is. They're not thinking through that, right? So they're just kind of using that loose regulation a bit and taking advantage and using marketing, and the more and more people looking in this space, right? So those resources you said are great. We did a podcast with OPSS. We know them well, and worked with USADA as well. So I'll put a link to some of those in the show notes so people can click on that and head over there, because that's what we do on a daily basis, just as you do, is try to help people through that supplement space and help them navigate through that, because it's my scientific word for supplements is messy. It's a messy space out there. So I'm not against people being in that space, but you do got to know what you're doing, what you're buying, if you need it, what role it's playing. It's all part of the process, right? Which that'll lead us to my last question. It's you've given us so much knowledge. I'll give you a chance to wrap all this together. But for really consumers out there as a whole, any other advice you would give to them that are considering nootropic products as a whole? I mean, my initial thoughts are, and you may or may not agree with me on this, but I'm like, okay, I would first want to talk to someone about what's your sleep habits? What are you eating? What are your stress reduction habits? I would think let's focus on that first, and then we could discuss something to play a role. Are you on the same page with me on that? And any other advice you got to wrap us
Yeah,
up? I'll take it.
100%. So, because I had studied herbal medicine and lifestyle medicine, it's always been this balancing act that I do in pharmacy, of seeing people add on more and more medications when I think, oh, if you just changed your lifestyle and your eating habits and your sleep habits,
Yeah.
we actually reverse these conditions that you have. And so I stayed in pharmacy ultimately to help get people off of medications. And I feel the exact same way about dietary supplements. If you don't need to add something that's a pill or a powder into your diet and can get it from a food source instead, that's always my first preference. If you can work on new habits and, CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapies, to actually change your ability to respond to situations and your habits, then that's always my first direction that I go. When it comes to actually selecting dietary supplements, I fully agree with working with someone who's very knowledgeable about how to assess the quality of those products and really customize the answer to that individual. So go to somebody who is a specialist in herbs, or a pharmacist who's really trained in dietary supplements, or a dietitian who's really trained in dietary supplements, and can help assess those things, and then know how to look for the risks as well. And before purchasing anything, look at the quality of the company. So just for an example, before I even selected my multivitamin that I take, I actually went to that manufacturing facility. And I know that this is not a step people would normally take, but I actually went to the facility in Utah, and, I looked at their processes and talked to the people who actually consider what is coming in the door, and how do they actually identify that white powder. Do they have some kind of confirmation process to prove it is what it says it is on the label? And just what kind of follow-up do they have? Do they recall products if necessary? And taking those extra steps to really dive in and do it. And you don't have to do it yourself, because there's people like me out there who are doing it instead. But yeah,
Yeah.
to really think twice about the quality of the product. We might have great evidence about that ingredient and how well it works for a cognitive enhancer or a different kind of dietary supplement, but you don't know what you're actually getting in that bottle unless that company takes the extra steps with an independent third-party testing company to actually verify what is in their product. So that's the conundrum right now with dietary supplements. Even if we know the ingredient works.
It's exactly, and just because it says it's on the label, does it in there, and at what amounts? That's all great advice. It's the same advice I hand out on a pretty regular basis. It's just do your homework, right? Like, you can't, you got to know what it is, not what the label says. You got to know what's in there, and there's ways to figure that out. Like you said, independent testing, or tracking down people like you, and that's why we tracked you down again. Was to put this knowledge out there. In the show notes as well, I'll put more information about you and what you have going on in your company and all that stuff, so people can reach out if they need you. But as a whole, thanks for your knowledge. This is so helpful to put this out there. I know a lot of people are in this space and they're looking for answers. It can get really overwhelming really quickly. And that's why we do this. We're all in this together to help them make, smart, healthy choices and achieve their goals the right way. So thanks for allowing us to take more of your time to pass this along. And it's been great. There's a lot of synergy between what you and I, have going on. So chances are we may see you again you might be our our first third time guest at some point down the road. There's so many things in this space that we could spend a full hour on just talking about. But until then, thanks again for helping us out. Thanks for the time. And
thank you.
hopefully we'll be in touch soon.